Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to Norwich City Council's Licensing Committee. It's Thursday, 3rd of March 2022. So we'll start with apologies. We've had apologies from Councillor Julie Brochett-Colton, Councillor Erin Fulton-McAllister and Councillor Ben Price. I don't believe we have any substitutes for those in place today. So we'll move on to the declarations of interest. I'm looking around and there are none. Public questions and petitions, again there are none today. So we have a look at the minutes now. Some of these minutes go back quite a long way. I trust everyone's had a chance to read them. Do you have any comments or suggestions as a result of those minutes, any matters arising? Okay, there was one for me, and there was a discussion in the previous committee that we had regarding the HMO policy, and the discussion was about delegated powers. And I'm going to ask Sarah Ashurst now to respond to that because it wasn't covered in the report. So Sarah, Head of Planning and Regulatory Services, is going to respond to that now, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we're currently looking at the licensing committee procedures with a view to kind of setting out clearer delegations to officers, but also areas where members of this committee would make decisions effectively. A report will come back to members to a future session for you to consider that before it's adopted. So members of officers, have drawn it together as a draft, and that draft is currently with NP Law. But we will be bringing a report back to you, which will set out quite clearly where this committee can make decisions and where things will be delegated to officers. So that detail will come in future weeks in front of you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sands, please.
One question, in reading through the papers, I noticed that there's going to be another public consultation. So we're having our meeting today to make decisions. Does that mean that these decisions won't necessarily be ratified and moved forward, or will we need to look at it again after the new consultation? Okay,
thank you for that question. Today we are looking at the report and accepting the report, or if we have questions and recommendations to go forward, potentially it could come back to committee before it goes to cabinet. Have I described that satisfactorily? Okay, so we are in a position to be able to make further changes today if the committee wishes to. Councillor Huntley, please.
Thank you, Chair. So just for clarity, this means that what we see on page 47, 16.1, will be coming back to us in a later report for us to consider.
Yes, Sarah, please.
So just to clarify, the report before members today, which we haven't moved to discuss yet, effectively asks you to note the current consultation responses from the previous consultation that's taken place, and look at the current changes proposed in this report in addition. And where there are no substantive additional issues that come out of this second round of consultation, we're asking you today to recommend to Cabinet that you're happy to agree the revised licensing policy or HMO licensing policy. If you wanted to make to change that to basically say we would like to see the responses of this second round of consultation before we recommend to Cabinet, that could be an alternative recommendation that you could make.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And just to follow up on that, it was decided to go out to consultation again because of the some changes that were made following essentially officer consultation. Councillor Sands.
Sorry, Chair, we are still on minutes. We haven't moved to the HMO licensing policy yet.
No, we haven't. We're talking about the minutes from the previous committees. Okay, thank you for that, Leonie. Okay, so
Chair, sorry, if I can intervene, please.
Yes.
It's just under minutes. You're looking for accuracy. You can't really make decisions under minutes. It's just looking for accuracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Giles, is this about the minutes, please?
Yes, thanks. With regards to crime figures and trends linked to the nighttime economy, the presentation was obviously cancelled at short notice last time. I think there was an incident in Mile Cross, and we said it would be be a presentation for another committee date. I don't think we've heard any more about that. Is there an update?
Again, thank you for the question. I thought that the police cancelled that meeting, and there was no plans to provide another one. Sarah, do you have any updates?
I don't, but I can certainly raise it with the team and with the police and see if we can get a further update for you on that.
Yeah, and we'll bring that back to another committee. Okay, does that complete the minutes? Thank you. Okay, so the next item is the HMO policy, page 23 of the pack. Members, purpose is for members to consider the changes to the draft HMO licensing policy following a period of consultation ending in November 2021, and consider further proposed officer amendments in respect of HMOs, house and multiple occupation licensed under the Housing Act 2004. The recommendation is to note the consultation responses and amendments, and recommend to Cabinet for adoption, subject to there being no substantive additional issues raised through this further round of consultation. Sarah, please, if you'd like to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I don't propose to go through the report. I will work on the assumption that members have read the report, but essentially on page 24, 24 and 25 of the report, you will note the changes that have been proposed from the policy. Under paragraph 4, the first two changes are as a result of the public consultation, and under paragraph 5, there's two changes proposed as a result of further internal consultation between officers. The report then goes on to kind of set out about the current consultation. So as a result of making those changes, we felt it was only right that we went back out to people to check that it had met their expectation, and particularly because officers had made further changes that hadn't previously been subject to public consultation, we wanted to go back out in the interest of transparency. The report, as Councillor Stutely has rightly said, just asks you to note those changes and to agree them, and to recommend to Cabinet that the HMO licence policy is adopted, subject, as I say, to there being no substantive issues that would alter the policy coming out of this further round of public consultation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have some questions from councillors. I'll look for people to indicate in a moment, and I'll start just by asking Sarah to highlight the from page 24, paragraph 5, onto page 25, where it outlines the difference in the policy there. For my benefit and members of the public and committee, can you just describe how this will work in practice, please?
Certainly, thank you, Chair. Essentially, what we're trying to do through the introduction of this policy, which isn't a statutorily required policy, but we feel it's good practice to introduce, is to drive up the standards, particularly of houses of multiple occupation across the city. So you'll note under paragraph 5 at section II that we're introducing the inspection of a property prior to a licence being issued. So currently we inspect at least once during the period of the licence, but we're looking to move that to before the licence being issued. We're also going to take into consideration how HMOs have previously been operated by the landlord. Essentially, if you tick all the boxes and you provide a good high quality standard of accommodation to people, then you will receive a 5-year licence. And the costs of that to you will be less than, for example, if you are a landlord who has operated without voluntarily applying for a licence, so you might have tried to operate under the radar, there have been significant hazards at your property, or you failed to comply with previous conditions of a licence. So effectively, landlords who fail to provide that high quality standard of accommodation will be penalised both through a shorter licence period, meaning that you'll be subject to more inspections and a greater cost of your licence, than if you are a good landlord who provides a good standard of accommodation. That's essentially what's behind that kind of tiered licence application process.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sands, please.
Okay, Okay, taking that in mind and given that most of these HMOs are student accommodation, you're saying that you have one inspection and then the decision is made whether it is good quality accommodation and the landlord is adhering to all the rules and regulations, and therefore they might get 5 years, 3 years or 1 year based on that one inspection. Is that correct?
The inspection is part of the process. Obviously, we know the history of each of the HMOs in our kind of area, so we will be aware of historic problems that we might have had at that address or with the particular landlord. So the decision to issue the licence will be based on our prior knowledge of the site and of the landlord and the property, as well as that inspection, to determine how good a quality of accommodation.
Okay, so if you, for instance, have an HMO, student accommodation, where it's poor quality, but the students aren't actually reporting back, I assume you're relying on the actual people living in the HMO to tell the council that the quality of accommodation isn't up to scratch. In my experience, I'm both at ward councillor, students quite often don't want to complain about it and they'll put up with it. At what point and sometimes they'll tell us, the ward councillors, but quite often
getting in contact with the team to let us know, and we obviously have a right to kind of go into these properties and then inspect them, and if we have a receipt of a complaint that is being adhered to, we would go in and inspect, and we would be able to enforce if the conditions of that licence were not being adhered to. So that would be the process. Let us know and we can investigate.
Thank you. Just further to that, much of our work as councillors relies on members of the public to contact us, especially for enforcement purposes. Councillor Maxwell, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was reading through this. How many HMOs we've actually... Is it? Oh, right, thank you. I couldn't find it. So, with the changeover, will they all be looked at? Or will we leave them for the length of... Have they got a term at the moment? Yeah.
So all mandatory licensable HMOs in the city currently are issued a 1-year licence. So every year we are renewing those licence applications effectively. We are looking currently through the budget setting process. We've secured an amount of money to update information about HMOs across the whole city, and that would include those not just those requiring mandatory licensing, but all HMOs, so which would fall below this threshold effectively, with a view in the future to looking at additional licensing for all our houses of multiple occupation. Sorry, forgive me, I forgot the first part of your question. Yes, so effectively, whenever a licence is renewed, and we're currently kind of renewing applications, but every time a licence is applied to be renewed, moving forward as a result of this policy, we would inspect that property. So we would be going back on a much greater basis, effectively, and it would be at that point that we make the judgment whether to issue the 5, the 3 or the 1-year licence.
Sorry, there's just one more question. Have we got enough staff to do that, or will we be taking on anybody else?
I was expecting that question, and it's a very good question. One thing I have kind of noticed here is that we don't have a dedicated officer to deal with this. So our private sector housing team, they're an incredibly dedicated and hard-working team, but they're also a very small team. So I've recently put forward a bid through the budget setting process to get a specific HMO inspections officer, and that's part of the reason why this policy has been delayed in bringing it before you.
The budget that went through, thank you. I saw Councillor Huntley, please.
Thank you, Chair. On page 37, at the very end of 8.1, the report reads, the Council has discretion to offer any length of licence it considers appropriate up to a maximum of 5 years. I'm understanding from 14.1 and other parts of this report that the offer would be 1 year, 3 year or 5 year. Which is it?
Yes, it would be. So apologies, that's probably an error, and we can look to amend that in paragraph 8.1.
Thank you. Yeah. So for the minutes, that's an item to amend. Councillor Sands, please.
Staying on page 37, 9.1, bullet point, first of all, bullet point, that the property is reasonably suitable for occupation by a maximum number of people. So I was wondering if you could describe to me what reasonable looks like.
I must confess, obviously, this is not my area of expertise, and I would probably say that would be a judgment made by the qualified and trained officers in the private sector housing team. But for example, they would be considering overcrowding, number of facilities that would be available. So I'm aware that, for example, where there are certain numbers of people, you need additional cooking facilities or additional bathroom facilities. So that would be the types of things that they would be looking at.
Yes, thank you. For members of the public and the committee, Sarah's standing in today for our public protection manager, who would normally answer these questions. So if anything does come up that we can't answer, we will come back to it. Okay, any other questions? Councillor Giles, please.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Chair. Well,
thank you for the promotion.
I've given you an elevated status. With regards to paragraph 9.12 on page 39, bullet point 1, when considering whether a person is fit and proper, the council will have regard to any wrongdoings of the relevant person concerned. Detailed convictions policy, like we have for taxi and private hire vehicle drivers, or do we feel this is adequate for landlords? Is it sufficiently clear and robust to stand up to potential appeals? And I just wondered what was meant by certain types of sexual offences. Which types of sexual offences would we consider and which we wouldn't, and what the rationale behind that would be?
Thank you, Councillor Giles, for your question. I would say that in drawing this policy together, we have looked at best practice across the country, and we obviously had a recent peer review by Oxford, their demographic and kind of student populations and numbers of HMOs across the city, and they have found that this kind of test stands up effectively. So I would probably advocate that we take this approach, and if we have any problems, we can always amend the policy in future. We do also have at paragraph 9.21 areas where we could request a DBS check. So we do have the ability to do that. For example, if somebody was known to us through other means, whether they had other licence applications, then we would be able to request a DBS check, and we would make that judgment. In terms of the latter part of your question, in terms of whether we would consider any sexual offences to be appropriate or not, my answer to that would be unlikely. I would imagine if you've been subject to a sexual offence and been found or convicted of it, that we would not be issuing you a licence.
Okay, thank you. And further to that, because we have the police as one of our consultees, we will have information supplied to us that's relevant, that would back those up. Okay, Councillor Giles, would you like to come back?
Yes, please. Do we therefore need to change the wording of certain types of sexual offences to all sexual offences? And I was going to ask whether MP Law were of the view that this bullet point was sufficiently clear and robust. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that is a good point, and it's something as a new paragraph or amended paragraph.
Yeah, I can certainly take those comments.
9.6 at the top there. The manager or a competent representative will need to operate within a reasonable proximity to the HMO so that she can attend to matters promptly and retain an overview on the condition of the premises and management of the tenancies. Now, in my ward, we do have some excellent landlords that live locally to the student accommodation, and they do attend. They're caring and supportive. However, we do have a number of HMOs where the landlords are absent, and some are not merely absent, they're not actually even in Norfolk or even in the country. When it says a competent representative, it's been in our experience that they're not sure what that representative looks like. Is there any way of firming that up so that we can actually have in writing that in order to get the, I mean, this may already be the case, but it just seems a bit woolly to me that there is a named representative that is actually on the licence and the contact for that person. Because, yeah, we do have some absentee landlords and we don't know who they are and we don't know how to contact them.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. And Sarah, with your answer, can you explain the differences or similarities of licence and the role of agents as well, estate agents? Thank you.
So there would be some instances, for example, where somebody might own a property and run it as a house or multiple occupation, but use an agency or something to run it for them. And that agency might, for example, be based in Norwich, but the actual licence holder might live in Scotland, for example. So we would consider that to be a competent representative who would be running that HMO on their behalf. I don't disagree with you that actually operating within a reasonable proximity is a little vague, and I think that's probably some language that we could firm up, albeit we would need to be reasonable. I don't think we could put a specific distance, but we could maybe look at some of that wording and amend it as necessary.
Let's come back to you. Okay, so it was experience, because probably not allowed to, but in that case, can we then report that particular estate agency I'm talking about here
with the responsibility that they should, then we need to know about that. Effectively, the fit and proper test is for the licence holder, and obviously anybody representing them who is running that on behalf of them must be a competent representative. So I would say it is a different test.
The role of estate agent, so some definitions there about what makes a good estate agent might be helpful for the future. Thank you.
Sorry, just a point of clarification as well. A competent representative might not simply also be an agent, an estate agency or some HMO agency, but it might be an individual as well. So I think it would be a useful point of clarification for us to add into the policy what we mean by that and the standards of that.
Okay. I have Councillor Huntley and then Councillor Maxwell, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is a related point. So on page 26, at paragraph 9, we have a list of statutory consultees. The penultimate one we're given an example of later on page 33. That's the National Residential Landlords Association, where it says one or more persons who appear to the authority to represent the interests or persons operating houses of multiple occupation. Is it agencies that you're thinking of here, and could perhaps some examples of that of the representatives be added at this point, because they don't appear elsewhere?
Yes, so I would imagine that would be estate agencies. It might be the Landlords Association. If there was a landlord forum, for example, in Norwich, then we would look to consult with them, and that's something that myself and the officers are quite keen, as I know Councillor Jones is, to set up and actually get a landlords forum moving forward once we can drive the standards up. So it would be those types of groups of individuals.
So just to clarify, that something like that could be added in at this point, just to explain some examples of who that, illustrate that point.
We can include examples, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Maxwell, Councillor Giles.
I'm still on this point. We've in my ward, we've got an HMO, and the person that controls it lives in Great Yarmouth, and it's not always open or available. And we had an incident there. And I was working with the police. I called them out, and they came over, and they couldn't get a hold of anybody, and it was a really dangerous situation. A sort of an idea of how far away they can live, and make sure they have 24 hours access. Can we do that?
I'll be honest with you, off the top of my head, I don't know if we can do that. I think, as I say, we need to be reasonable, and actually I think Yarmouth probably would be a reasonable distance. The question would be, I suppose, when they renewed their licence, that incident had come up. Were they complying with the conditions? Were they available? Were they competent, therefore? So we might raise those questions in any licence renewal. I've made a note that we can take back paragraph 9.6 to the team to look at definitions of competent representative and revisit that kind of reasonable proximity and see if we can tighten that wording up. So.
It is also on the other side. It is there is potential for a very good landlord to live a substantial distance away, and we wouldn't want to exclude those from being licensees in Norwich. Okay, Councillor Giles, please.
Thanks.
As well, and I've very recently connected with the new estate manager at the UEA with a view to having discussions about how they can help us in terms of some of the wider implications of HMOs in the city. So those HMOs off site or student accommodation off the university site. So those are conversations that I'm progressing with them as well.
Thank you for that. Yes, I like the idea of consulting with as many groups as possible. So if members have any further suggestions of consultees, please put them forward. I saw Councillor Ackroyd next, please.
Thank you. I might be going slightly off the point here, and I can't find the actual bit that I'm looking for, but following on from what you've just said about the sort of impact on Norwich and on areas, and I believe that I read somewhere that 6 months after implementation of this policy, it would be something that would be looked at, because it's obviously a big concern to residents. Not that they don't want HMOs, but there is an impact on areas for having them. And have I read that? I keep leafing through trying to have a look. Is that something that will happen? Thank you.
The policy can be subject to regular review. As I say, it's not a statutory policy. It's something that we could adopt tomorrow and we could review immediately thereafter. I'm very acutely aware of some of the problems that HMOs can cause across the city. I think it was possibly something I alluded to earlier in this meeting. So through the budget setting proposal, we've got some money to update our evidence across the whole city of HMOs. So we'll be looking, as I say, not just at those which require mandatory licensing, but all HMOs across the city. So where are they located? What volumes are there in particular locations, with a view to looking at additional licensing moving forward. So that would license every single HMO in the city, as opposed to just those which currently require the mandatory licensing. So that's something that we're very keen to do, and to look at that additional licensing, but we need to update the evidence base to inform that, because it's a decision that goes through the Secretary of State. So.
Okay, thank you. So the relevant section is the Appendix 2, the Consultation Responses. A number of members of the public responded on that issue, and that appendix is so good we printed it twice. Councillor Sand is next, please.
I'm glad you talked about that, Sarah and Ian, because that's something obviously I was going to bring up. I mean, this was written obviously by a resident in University Ward, but it could have been written by myself. Number 3 on page 49 of the Appendix 2 Consultation Responses, where it says no policy amendment proposed. So what you're saying then is we're going to do a review and see what the outcome is after 6 months. So where it says no policy amendment proposed, is that in agreement with what you're saying, or does that contradict it? Because quite frankly, just in my own small cul-de-sac, we are outnumbered by student accommodation.
We're looking to get a consultant in to look at that evidence base across the city. Depending on what comes out of that evidence base, we can then make an informed decision as to whether to pursue additional licensing or even ultimately selective licensing. So all private rented accommodation requires a license in the future. But at the moment, as I say, we're looking to get the evidence base up to date, looking at exactly what you've just said. So in areas of streets across the city, what is the proportion of HMOs to normal residents? To update that evidence base. Off the top of my head, I don't know the criteria they looked at, but they were quite rigorous. The joy, dare I say, of bringing both planning and private sector housing together into one service is we can get greater communication. So there's probably some evidence that we've already got in terms of housing need, demographics, etc. in the planning policy team, as well as local knowledge of the city and the private sector housing team. And these consultants will kind of look at those additional criteria. I imagine council tax would have been looked at, number of occupants listed on the electoral register, known landlords, what other properties do they own, etc. So there's a whole raft of information to go through to gather that evidence base, and ultimately what it looked at, what are the levels of student accommodation to private home ownership or private rented accommodation in streets, and what's an appropriate level, and looking at licensing above a specified level. So I think at that time there were only a couple of wards which were quite badly affected, but as I say, that evidence base is now 5 or 6 years out of date, so it needs updating to inform that decision.
Could I say that we came back and our ward was considered to not to have too many student HMOs. However, what actually happens within the ward, and you'll appreciate this, is some areas of the ward, the ones i.e. nearer to the university, do have a higher number of student HMOs, whereas in the parts of the ward that are further away from the university, near, say, to Cossey, have less. So when you're talking about the number of HMOs or saturation of HMOs within a ward, it's so in some areas, yes, that is still an issue. And of course, with private rental, when you've got houses, I don't know how we want to privately rent in Berthorpe Ward because they simply can't afford that kind of rent.
I think that there's a whole kind of cooking pot effectively of information. So I mean, we're also looking at updating our purpose-built student accommodation needs document in the planning policy team, and the driver behind that is by building purpose-built student accommodation you might alleviate the pressure on the HMO market and private rented market. And all of this will inform that decision, and I absolutely take your point that it's not an even spread across each ward. And actually, I think some of the wards which are most affected, they might be actually slightly further away because they're slightly more desirable or trendy locations that students want to live. So I used to be a resident of Nelson Ward, and I know there was quite a large student population there, slightly further out from the university as well. So all of this needs looking at, as I say, to inform that decision and any application we make to the Secretary of State.
Yes, thank you for that. I think the data will be extremely interesting to a number of us, but it is also worth remembering that such a policy comes under planning. Is that correct?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So there are routes. There are routes replanning where you can, for example, as we are recently doing in terms of office accommodation, introduce what's called an Article 4 direction. So it would remove, say for example, there's a threshold at which a private house with multiple people in it becomes, in planning terms, a house of multiple occupation, and that is a different definition, unfortunately, to the definition of a house of multiple occupation in the Housing Act, just to confuse things. Again, in terms of an Article 4 direction, all that would do is require a planning application to be submitted. What you would then need is the planning policies in place, which would enable you to either approve or refuse that planning application on the basis of material planning grounds. And what we don't have at the moment is an evidence base to inform if that policy is the right approach. So the evidence base for HMOs will allow us to make an informed decision about whether we introduce a development management policy and an Article 4 direction, or whether we go down the route of additional licensing and driving up standards. So, and it's all interlinked, which I suspect is one of the reasons why I was given these services altogether.
Yes, I'll just look for other councillors, but as we've just been talking about policy at Cabinet level, we have the Cabinet member, Councillor Jones, with us. Is there anything that you'd like to add? If you can come and find a suitable seat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to reiterate, this is very much part of an ongoing process, and I think it's important also to look at the primary purpose from my point of view as a Cabinet member is we need to drive up standards across the city. It's not so much about who lives there or what type of accommodation, it's about we need high quality accommodation across our city for every resident. And I think one of the reasons we need that evidence base is, yes, I represent a ward with a high student population, but also we have a lot of HMO, a lot of young people particularly, who the only choice of accommodation is HMOs. They might not be students, and they're often in other parts of the city. And I'm really it's really important to me those are not forgotten as well when we were looking at where we drive up those standards. I am very committed to looking at additional and selective licensing powers in the future. This is part of an ongoing process. It's not going to be quick, but it's something I am very, very keen on because everyone has the right to safe accommodation in our city.
For the residents of this city, but I'm also obviously not a comparable city per se, but it was striking that there was the Freedom of Information Act done by the local press there that found that 15 so-called super landlords dominate the rental market there to the extent that they own a quarter of the HMO properties there. And so when we do this research looking into the kind of the state of play, as it were, in Norwich, I would be very interested to put some freedom of information requests in, because there is evidence to show that they are skewing the market and making sure that prices are going up to make them unaffordable. And we know all about the cost of living crisis, and rent is one of the big things that affect people who live in HMOs. So I'd be very interested to find out if you might already know some of the figures for Norwich, but I think that would be really important. And is there any way, and I don't know if, and I don't think it's touched in here, and I don't know if it's even possible, but that there's some way that we can either cap numbers so that there's no way that there's that possibility of these super blocks in effect skewing the market to that degree, or if there's any way that we can limit the numbers that people can own rental properties in one city or one district, please.
On the first point, we will have a list of all the landlords who own or operate HMOs in this area. I'm not aware that we have any issues, particularly with kind of somebody dominating the market effectively, but I can take a look, ask the team and get that information to you if you require. In terms of preventing people from having more than a maximum, I'm not sure that we could do that. I'm not sure the legislation would be in place, and I'm not sure whether it would be reasonable. I don't know. I can absolutely see your point in terms of them not being able to dominate the market in terms of this, but I'm not sure we could stop or prevent people buying properties and how they kind of operate them. The thing we could do is require them to be licensed, drive up the standards that way. But again, I'm not sure, we've got the power or the legislation in place that we could prevent people buying properties and running them as HMOs to a maximum number.
And obviously this is at the behest of the chair here. I mean, I personally would like to see that, and I'd be interested to know if you could find out if we do have those powers, and maybe at a future licensing meeting we can maybe discuss the concerns that I've raised here. And I don't know if it's quite right when we're just amending in effect a document, but it's something that certainly is a concern to me, if that's okay.
It would suggest to me the fact that there are, in other parts of the country, places that do kind of have these super landlords operating, that there isn't the legislation that would enable us to do that. That would be my best guess, but I can certainly answer the question with the team and get back to you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think as chair and someone that's always interested in the data, all data that we can uncover will be useful to us going forward, and this would be interesting to see. And as Sarah said, if it's not controlled in other authorities, it's unlikely that we can control it. Of course, the best way, or another alternative way of controlling and keeping housing affordable is rent caps and provide enough housing in the first place, which of course this authority would very much like to do, given government support. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Giles, please.
Thank you, Chair. I won't call you Lord Mayor this time.
Feel free.
Okay. Page 39, 9.12, the second bullet point, with regards to the fit and proper person test, that lists the consideration of whether or not they've practiced unlawful discrimination on the grounds of some protected characteristics, but some of the protected characteristics seen from that list, and I thought that needed, unless there was a legal reason why some of them should be excluded. Thanks.
We can absolutely include those, that's not a problem.
Yes, thank you. We have had similar omissions from other policies, so we can refer to those other policies to make sure we get them all in. Thank you for the question. Okay, are there any other questions at the moment? I'll come back to you in a moment, Councillor Schmier. I've just got one further one, and that is to just ask Sarah to in reference to paragraph 9.15 on page 40, and that is the list of transgressions that applicants are required to notify us of voluntarily. So can you describe how that will be checked and what stops abuse of the self-declaration process?
That we had made, so a number of parts of those would be open to us. Obviously, as referenced previously, we do have essentially the landlord has a duty to declare this information to us when they're kind of stating that they are a fit and proper person. If it turned out that they kind of had effectively lied to us and we later found it out, then we do have the option to revoke their licence.
And presumably that would be considered a serious breach.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we don't currently have a routine DBS check for our HMO licence holders. Can you describe why and what would trigger one, please?
As I say, kind of in the process of consulting, we do kind of go to the police, and they obviously would alert us to any individuals who had history of a dubious past, shall we say, and that might provoke us to go down the route of a DBS check. Essentially, as I say, it's for the landlord to demonstrate that they are a fit and proper person. I am not aware, I'll be honest, of whether we can require a DBS check as part of this, but I can certainly ask the question.
Okay, thank you. So Councillor Schmierer was next. I'm not seeing anybody else at the moment. Councillor Schmierer, then Councillor Huntley, then Councillor Giles, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I just turn our attention to page 43, please? Well, actually 42 to 43, about the amenity standards and licence conditions. And this sort of links on from what was some colleagues have already said, I think regarding, page 37, the sort of processing of the application, and that property is reasonably suitable for occupation by a maximum number of people. I mean, there's obviously this whole list in 10.7 about kind of expectations. And apologies here, I mean, there's also in 10.6 a mention to amenity standards attached to Appendix A. Have I managed to miss that, or I can't seem to see it, I'm afraid, these amenity standards. But the reason why I ask this is because, again, I'm going to go to Scotland, and I know, of course, they have a different legal system, which might explain why they haven't been able to do anything about their issue of the super landlords. But back to this point here, about HMOs. So any time any HMO property comes available with 3 or more unrelated people, for example, living there, they need to put fire doors in. They need to put the fire extinguishers, and a whole load of basically fire safety standards by default have to come in at that point. That is the cut-off. And I don't think we've got a strong legislation or even recommendations here, and I might like to see, and certainly as they've got up in Scotland. So I was wondering, is there a way we can either have something a little bit clearer put into this? It might be contained in Appendix A, in which case I do apologise, I missed it. But I think that at the moment it is still very nebulous, and it doesn't clarify what is expected of a landlord and an HMO landlord to ensure things like fire safety, decent living standards, beyond what is the statutory stuff in terms of room size and occupancy.
Out, and my apologies that hasn't been included here for members today. But we do already have that document adopted, and it is in place, and that is the standard to which we require landlords to adhere.
Yes, thank you for that question. The amenity standards document is a separate document that is fixed. We wouldn't have an opportunity to amend that today, but it is missing from this side of it in the previous committee when we discussed this. Okay, thank you. So, Councillor Huntley, I saw.
Chair, I'd like to go back to the popular page 37 here. So in 8.1, there's an indication that at the discretion of the licensing team, a layout plan of each floor of the property can an accurate or detailed layout plan of each floor of property.
I can say in response to this, I feel your pain. and I sympathise with it from my many years in planning. We can specify the quality to which it's submitted. There are some landlords who would have the ability to draw very detailed CAD drawn drawings, but there are also landlords who they only have access to a pen and a bit of graph paper effectively. Introduction of the inspection prior to the licence being issued, if that plan was required, obviously be able to check its accuracy and make sure that it did actually reflect on the ground. What we could look to do is potentially again provide some kind of standards. You must make sure you include the following. So we could look to add some detail to that.
Thank you very much. I think that would be a helpful addition. It has been a problem at some committees we've had where we haven't had a clear plan to work with. So anything that can clarify that would be appreciated.
Well, okay, Councillor Giles, please.
Thank you, Chair. Risk assessment is in place for the HMO. Do we feel this is strong enough, or should we just ask for a copy of the fire risk assessment initially for all applications?
I'll be honest with you, I'd need to check that with the team as to whether we could require that. Effectively, landlords should be able to, as it states further on in that paragraph, provide us with copies of any documentation within simply signing that self-certification form without the ability to actually kind of provide that documentation. Again, this will be something that we'd be able to look at in terms of our inspection prior to issuing the licence. The officers will know what fire things should kind of be in a property. So, for example, have they got the right doors? Have they got self-closers? Have they got the right fire extinguishers? Couldn't think of the word then, sorry. So they would be able to kind of see that self-certification certificate, and the officers who visit that property would know whether what was on the ground was actually accurate or not, and at that point they might then require the full fire risk assessment copy.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Shamira, please.
Could I just go back to page 26, no, 25, apologies, about the 3-year licence. Now, I remember we obviously discussed this at the last meeting, and I totally understand why, you've got your good landlord, runs a few properties, everything's up to date, 5-year licence, let them be. If they have been good up to this far, carry on, sort of thing. The question I've got is about this 3-year licence, because some of these concerns that are listed there would be of considerable concern if I had a son or a daughter and was living in a place like that. The existence of hazards at the property. I think there was a whole load of other ones, non-compliance with building regulations and the other such, like in the no written tenancy. These are quite big concerns to me, and I'm just wondering, is there a reason why we can't just take that category out and just have, for the people who don't comply with it, they get a 1-year licence, and if they're good, they get a 5-year licence? Can you maybe explain that, please, that middle category, please?
Of course. I feel it would be overly draconian to be able to only have a 1 or a 5-year licence. For example, there might be somebody who for a number of years has operated on a 5-year licence and been a good landlord, and unfortunately one thing goes wrong in response to the property and all of a sudden they go down to a 1-year licence. I think a middle ground needs to be had. It's about being pragmatic and working with the landlords to ensure that they address their issues. There are some very slight differences between the 1, the 3 and the 5. So for example, in terms of those existence of hazards at the property, you'll note that a 1-year licence is the existence of significant hazards. So for example, we'd be issuing a 1-year licence potentially where there'd previously been category 1 hazards, those kind of excess cold, fire issues. A 3-year licence might be there's a few things that are wrong, but they're not a category 1 hazard. So that's why we've introduced the stage approach. So if you had a 5-year licence and then all of a sudden you just had, for example, some issues with your windows that you could address quite simply, but you'd either have to issue a 1-year licence claiming that to be a significant hazard, and I don't think we'd have the grounds. I just think it's about being pragmatic, helping our landlords to get to that 5-year licence stage. And as I say, first offence, it's about helping to get their house in order, quite literally. And I think that middle ground is probably a good way to do it.
Can I come Come back, please. Yeah, I understand that, of course, and the example that you give is a perfectly reasonable one. You know, someone did a bit of paperwork wrong or whatever it might be. But, I mean, I'm just thinking that, I mean, there's also a lot of pressure on officers here, because without knowing what this sort of list is as councillors, I don't know what the difference between a serious failure to comply with HMO management regulations is compared to a failure to comply with HMO management regulations. I don't know what the difference is between serious concerns raised by the police and concerns raised by the police, and it would be good to have that sort of matrix of things for us so that we know what we're signing up to here, because giving someone a 3-year licence to run their house as they see fit, I mean, if there are issues, and maybe they're not category 1 concerns there, I would still think, you know, you go to a 1-year licence, you get your house in order, then you get your 5-year licence when things are all okay. That would be the way I would prefer to see it done, rather than having this sort of halfway thing where it's sort of, you're not that bad, so go on then. I would just...
If I'm honest, and I'm not sure we could identify every specific instance where we would go. Effectively, where we have serious or significant concerns, so if the police are raising concerns that there might be unspent convictions that might place those tenants at risk, you know, we would either choose to refuse the licence or only grant a 1-year licence. For example, if the police raised, you know, there have been some issues of noise from this property, that's a less severe representation from the police than saying there's some serious concerns about the person operating this premise. I do feel quite strongly that this kind of 1, 3 and 5 is a good way to go forward. I think also in terms of resources, purely having a 1 and a 5 might actually put more burden on the officers. The 1-year licence, we're intending that, you know, as I say, we'll be kind of crawling all over this property a lot of the...
I'll come back to issues are and at what stage of the process they're in.
You need to do some work in terms of, you know, making sure your windows are properly openable, you've got the right number of bins. We'd like you to, you know, make sure your doors and things kind of open properly. So there would be some small interventions. Throughout the course of that 3-year licence, we might visit the property one more time to either check that those works had been done or just to do a kind of midpoint check about 1.5 years in, make sure that everything was still as it should be. In terms of a 1-year licence, we would be going out initially. We might be aware that there have been significant hazards at that property before. We might highlight some areas that needed doing, and if it wasn't so bad as that we would be refusing that application, I would expect that we would be revisiting within 3, 6 and possibly even 9 months later. The cost of your 1-year licence will be significantly greater because of the amount of officer intervention that would need to be had. And that's why I think that the kind of the midway point is a good point. And effectively, it is what you said, you know, there are some issues here. We are going to come back and check, but we don't need to devote all the time that we need to be like we would be on the 1-year licences with those landlords who really aren't providing accommodation to the highest standards. That's where our focus needs to be, and the 3 and 5 year interventions would allow us to focus on those ones effectively.
Okay, thank you for that. Does that answer your question for now? From my point of view, as chair, I think the interim 3-year period is a sensible solution because we're talking about saving officer time. When I read paragraph 17 in the report, it's on. Forgive me, it's on page 28. It makes a compelling argument about how the process will work, and if we do have landlords that are persistently not meeting standards and subsequently having that 1-year standard and their standards are not raised, ultimately they will pass on those additional costs that they'll receive to their tenants. So I think the plan to drive up standards, and therefore those with the 5-year licences will have less costs year by year, is the right way to go, and I think that's what I would like to support. I understand this is working successfully in at least one other authority. Can you give us any information about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Oxford City, who, as I've kind of said previously, are very akin to us in terms of demographic and housing makeup. They've been operating a tiered approach for a number of years, and they have also introduced additional licensing, and they've got this kind of tiered approach across all houses of multiple occupation, and they are upheld nationally as good practice. Their landlords are engaged with them. They want to get to that 5-year standard, and effectively it allows you to focus on your really bad landlords. It allows you to devote your staff time to those landlords who aren't doing what they should do, which allows you to kind of, dare I say it, get your income in, to get your enforcement officers out there and to kind of bring your resources up that way. But it also makes your landlords not want you to come around quite so often, so it does force them to do it. As I say, Oxford has got pretty good standards of housing, and their policy is kind of upheld nationally as good practice. So, and they were certainly really helpful and really clear with us that this has been a positive move for them over the last few years when they did our peer review.
Okay, thank you. Actually, as an individual whose daughter will be going into an HMO as student accommodation next year, I would have concerns about seeing lists like this, and obviously would wish to have that clarification. So it's good to have that now. But I do understand that non-compliance with building regulations could mean something very, very minor, a technicality, or something quite serious, and officers will have the ability to make judgments according to where those sit within a range. So our environmental protection officers are highly trained, and the new position will be somebody of a high level of competence as yet to be recruited. Okay, thank you, Councillor Schmier, and then Councillor Maxwell.
Yeah, sorry to come back on that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the resources, I've got no problem, I think, with the fact that we're moving over to a sort of 5-year model, which is kind of what the basis of this, as I understand it, was. Because if we have got very good landlords who are looking after their properties, a light touch approach, I think, makes a lot of sense. I think my concern is for those landlords, and the list that you mentioned there of things like windows not opening properly or completely, doors not shutting fully, that would be a big concern for me. And these aren't, in my opinion, minor things. These are quite major for someone paying huge amounts of their take-home pay each month to rent a property if these things are not done. So I still do have concerns, without having that full matrix and full knowledge, that there is that for those 3-year licences. And I think also, as I understand it, it says on bullet point 14 on page 27, the fee should cover the costs of these licences. So this should be cost neutral to the council. There should be the capacity to be able to do this. So I don't think we should necessarily worry about that if we are going to fulfil that statement there. So I mean, I would still very much encourage us to have a 1-year licence, or if you're technicalities, that really don't really make that much difference, and we leave that at the behest of the expertise of the officers, or we go with the 5-year. That would be my way of doing it, and I think I would like to put that, if I may, to the vote here as
okay.
an amendment.
Can we take more questions on this specific issue, and then we can put that to a vote. So, Councillor Maxwell, on this issue.
Very simply, how long can they, or how many times can they have a year 1 licence?
Well, there's no limit effectively on how many times they could have a 1-year licence, and we currently operate a 1-year licence, and I think there are some good landlords out there, and there are some middle of the road landlords out there who, with a little bit of incentivisation, might get to a 5-year licence. I suppose also introducing this 3-tiered approach will relieve some of the immediate burden on officers. So we're currently, as I say, operating the 1-year licence. I don't know what proportion of our current landlords would hit the 5. it might be quite a high proportion, it might be quite a small proportion, in which case we're not actually going to achieve anything to help the resource in the department get out there to do the enforcement at the moment. I would still strongly advocate that we go for this 1, 3 and 5 year licence and potentially review it in 12 months' time after implementation, see if it's achieving what we want it to, and then potentially look to take a stronger line of the 1 and 5. But certainly the intermediary, I think, will help us in the fairly immediate future, alongside the introduction of the inspection before the licence being issued, to kind of get over the backlog that we've currently got, start driving those standards up. But as I say, I'm more than happy to review it in 12 or 18 months' time to see how well it's bedding in.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Thomas, please.
Thank you. My question is to clarify, anybody who has the 1 year licence, if you're satisfied that things are going all right after the year, obviously you can issue another year licence, but would they then would they graduate to the 3 year licence before they could get a 5 year licence?
I think that's a good question, and I think there would have to be a fairly significant change to go from a 1 straight to a 5. So I would probably see landlords progressing through the 1, 3 and then 5 year licences. I suppose kind of slightly going back to Councillor Maxwell's point, if you're repeatedly only getting that 1 year licence, I imagine we would be crawling all over you in terms of enforcement, quite frankly, and landlords are then going to start getting hit in their own pocket through civil penalties. They're going to want to progress, they're going to want to get these 3 or 5 year licences, or potentially even walk away and think this is too much hassle. But yeah, there may be the odd instance where somebody goes, do you know what, I really need to take this seriously. They put the effort in and they get the 5 year licence. But obviously in granting that 5 year licence, we would be mindful that previously they've only had a 1 year, so we would probably take a precautionary approach and see them going through that scale.
Personally, I think I'd be unhappy about someone going from a 1 to a 5, because 5 years is a long time and you can get a lot of differentials. I understand about the administration issues and the officer time, but I think first and foremost it's to make sure the HMOs are being run properly and the people in them are safe and secure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Thomas. Yeah, the safety of our residents is the highest priority with this. And I think, and you're right, the 5 year licence is a long time, and it's while it's desirable to get people onto the 5 year licence, the interim may add that extra safeguard where we have a further set of inspections at the renewal process. So thank you for that. I saw Councillor Ackroyd, please, and then Councillor Giles and Councillor Huntley.
Yeah, it was just a question about the 3 year licence, where some of the things on here are significant, as has already been said, the existence of hazards at the property. And you were saying, Sarah, enforcement, or an inspection happens, things are not right, and so obviously then people have got to the landlord's got to put that, he's got to put it right, she's got to put it right. This is about tenants and their lives. How long are they given to put it right? How soon is another inspection made? Because, the hazards could be, they could cause life-threatening problems to people. So, what's the time scale on that before it's got to be put right, before, a property could be closed down for the benefit of the people who live there, really, because it's not right that you live in something which is so bad for you.
Absolutely, and I mean, I'd be honest, I don't know the specific timescales off the top of my head, but the team are all over this, and where we take enforcement action, we have to give a landlord a reasonable amount of time to do the works, but those timescales are quite tight. They do come with big penalties. For example, there are some issues around management responsibilities on an HMO at the moment, which we are pursuing. We're seeking something in the region of £38,000 worth of penalties against that landlord, so it hurts them in their own pocket. Which they have to do the works within a significant amount of time, or they get that penalty put on them effectively. So there are serious ramifications if you don't do this, and those timescales are set out in legislation, but I'm afraid I don't know them off the top of my head. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll just take questions from Councillor Huntley, then Councillor Giles, and then Councillor Sands, and then we'll bring a halt to the discussion and talk about recommendations.
I think it was Councillor Giles before me.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll really just sort of wanted to point out the last time we discussed this, we did take a very strong steer from those other authorities that were using this three-tiered approach of 1, 3 and 5 years. It really did seem quite convincing in terms of the efficiency and the effectiveness of doing this. I'm sort of reminded we were sort of convinced in the way that as you said before, Sarah, the burden on officer time might play into how effectively we can do this.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that this model is geared to enable us to bring up these standards, or to enable landlords to bring up their own standards, so that we can free up resources for inspections, enforcement, and also finding HMOs that are not registered with us, so that we can again increase our revenues for the process. Councillor Giles, please.
Thanks, Chair. Firstly, a generic question, but relevant to this, is whether MP Law were happy with the robustness of the document, just to confirm that, and have they given apologies for today, do we know?
Thank you, good question.
In terms of NP law, I think before this goes to Cabinet, they will obviously see the policy. I'm not aware that they've raised any specific concerns with it to this point. On the latter point, I'll defer to Leonie.
They stated that they didn't have any further comments and therefore were happy with the policy as presented today.
Thanks.
Okay, that's noted by the committee.
Just onto my specific points. Leonie's just said what MP Law said, so they know far better than us. But I was thinking in terms of serious, going back to previous points made. In terms of Oxford City Council's three-tiered approach, do they provide more detail than that? And by leaving it as vague as we are we exposing ourselves to potentially successful appeals? But by creating that uncertainty within our policy, and I think it goes back to the point I made earlier with regards to the convictions policy. With regards to my view of whether we should have a 3-year or two-tier system, I do agree we should have the 3-tier system. I think it will free up the necessary resource that's much required to take the enforcement action against the worst landlords in the city that we haven't been able to do as much as we'd like today. However, with regards to a couple of the criteria under 3-year licence, personally, under no provision of written tenancy or licence agreements, personally I think that should go in the 1-year licence. I think that's not a matter of degree, either it has been provided or it hasn't. And if it hasn't been, I think that should be in the 1-year licence criteria. That's my personal view. And with regards to failure to comply with non-compliance with building regulations, with regards to some of the other criteria under 3-year licence, we've got failure and then serious failure under 1 year. Under non-compliance of building regulations, do we need serious non-compliance of building regulations under 1 year? And they were the points I was going to make. Thanks.
Thank you for those points. I would be very happy to see serious non-compliance of building regulations in the 1-year tier. We'll just take one more question. Sarah, would you like to come back on that first, and then I'll come to Councillor Sands?
Yeah, thank you. In terms of no provision of written tenancy or licence agreements moving into the 1 year, I'm happy to kind of look into that and potentially move that into the 1 year. In terms of the non-compliance with building regulations, if I can just go back and take a view on that, if that's all right, and maybe return to you. I think the reason some of these things are in the 3-year is that it might be that simply they haven't regularised it, similar to the kind of planning requirements. So it might be that they're operating without their building regulation certificate, but everything is actually all right. So I think I'd be happier to add, maybe change the words failure to regularise with building regulations and then potentially non-compliance in the 1 year, if that makes sense. But I'll take a view on that and certainly see if we can add something in.
Okay, Councillor Giles, are you content for that to be delegated, or would you like to take a committee view on that now?
With regards to no provision of written tenancy or licence agreements, I'd like to take the committee's view. I think with regards to building regs, I think it would be good to hear the expert opinion personally, but other committee members may feel differently.
Personally, I agree with that, and perhaps we should have a consideration to moving that. But first, we've heard from Councillor Schmira a proposal to remove one of these tiers and just have the 1 and 5 year tiers. Having heard further arguments, do you still wish to put that forward as a proposal? Or, Sarah made a suggestion that we could review this after 1 year, and personally, I'd be very happy to do that. Would you like to put that forward still, Councillor?
Yeah, I'd like to just hear, obviously it might get voted down very quickly and I might be the only one standing with my hand up, that's fine. But yeah, I would certainly, in any circumstance, I think this is an important document that if things are going potentially very well, let's hear from it and say things are good, pass it through the agenda. And if things can be improved, then let's come back in no later than 2 years' time, so 2024. March 2024, if that's okay with the rest of the committee, and have this item come back and a sort of review of it. Would that be, if I can, in 2 years, so 24 months? Yeah.
Well, yes, certainly. I think that's. I'm getting nods from cabinet member as well, and I would like to see perhaps tier 1 and tier 5. And so subsequently, all the elements of tier 3, the 3-year licence going into the 1 year licence category. Okay.
Yeah.
4, and all those against. 6, including me.
Yeah.
And abstentions. No abstentions, so that's not carried, that falls. Okay, thank you. But the proposal to have a review and a report in a year's time and a review in 2 years' time is something I think that I've not had any objections to, so that's something that we can put forward. Councillor Sands, please.
Okay, thanks. I've got 2 things and I do have a proposal. The first one is HMOs are sold on all the time, you see them advertised. So if a new landlord takes over an HMO which has a 5-year licence, does that new landlord then go back to the very beginning?
Yeah. Thank you, sorry. So the licence goes with the landlord, it doesn't go with the property, so any new licence and any new landlord would need a new licence.
My proposal is, and I hope that this is okay, I propose that we read the second consultation responses before this goes to Cabinet. My proposal is that we read the second consultation and the responses before we send this to Cabinet.
Okay, so just a reminder, there's a consultation in progress now, and it runs till the 28th of March, and that is consultation on the document that we're discussing today, and any substantive changes that we make to that would require us to have a look at it again. I suppose the question we have first of all is, does anybody consider that any of the items that we have put forward today are substantive? And Sarah, do you believe that they are substantive?
I think there's possibly a couple of substantive items, but also a number of questions that members have asked, which I'll be honest, I don't know the answers to. So actually, I think Councillor Sands makes a very good point that actually at the end of this consultation period, the report is brought back to licensing committee and those questions that you've asked today can be fully answered by the officers.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think we need a vote on that, but if anybody has any objections and would like to put it straight to Cabinet, say so now. I'm not seeing any. So I think we're sort of reaching the end of the debate. I'll give anybody else another chance to speak if they wish to. Councillor Thomas, then Councillor Huntley, and then I'll just ask Councillor Jones one more time if she wants to speak.
Thank you. It's just one quick question. I wanted to ask, I see under 3-year licence, we've got the existence of hazards at the property. I wanted to qualify what hazards are we talking about?
So, for example, the serious hazard, significant hazard at the property in the 1-year licence would be something that would be kind of heading probably in a category 2 direction or towards a category 1 direction. The existence of hazards at the property in the 3-year licence, I think, would probably be things like kind of loose carpets, things where windows need some work to make sure that they are openable and meet the regulations. So it would be some of those kind of smaller maintenance issues, which, if left, would then turn into significant hazards.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Huntley, please.
Thank you, Chair. On page 47, 16.1, I know we've addressed this at the beginning of the meeting. All the decisions are delegated to the post of Head of Planning and Regulatory Services. I just wondered the rationale for no councillors being involved in any of this. We are involved in making fit and proper person deliberations in terms of taxi drivers. Why not here?
I think that's a very good question. I think there's a large number of HMO licence applications, and the point at which you would be kind of involved in that would potentially have the ability to weigh the licensing committee down quite substantially. And I think it might be something that we would look to reconsider potentially in 2 years once this policy is bedded down. And for example, it might be where in the future, if we were looking to remove somebody down to a 1-year licence, we might look to bring that towards or for you. But I think at the moment it would probably weigh this committee down with an awful lot of applications that you would be considering.
Would that even be the case if we were to be looking at somebody being moved, let's say, to a 1-year licence?
Don't forget that everybody only gets a 1-year licence at the moment, so.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jones, would you like to just address the committee before we wind up, please?
Thank you for all your comments on that. I'd just like to respond to a few bits and pieces that are raised, such as, yes, we can cover the costs of inspection with our licence fee. But one of the reasons there was a request for more money in the budget is enforcement actually is something that's separate. That's why we have to put charges on things. That's why the budget was as it was. Thank you for those that voted for it. This is really serious that we can do that enforcement, but the legislation doesn't allow us to include enforcement action in part of the licence fee. So we can charge for every inspection, but it is very clear, and I don't want us to legally fall foul of that. So I think that's very important to note. So that's one of the reasons why when Councillor Spear said, well, we can keep charging this, the landlord, we have to be very, very careful around that. I've had to learn a lot of housing legislation. It's not my specialism. But I'm really glad we can go with the tiered approach. I think it gives us the opportunity to really tackle those worst landlords. I would ask, and I would probably need to clarify, because we are keen to introduce licensing committee at some point. We can do, and I hope you would go along with that, because it's really important that we can have the funding to do as much of this as possible. So that's one of the reasons that we want to push this policy forward. So if we do need to bring you all back, respect. So that's why there's a sort of time pressure on it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So we resolved then to note the contents of the report, but also we're going to bring it back to committee before we send it subsequently to Cabinet. So what is the earliest timeframe for that process, please?
I mean, if you were willing to convene a special licensing committee, which I believe can still run in the pre-election period because it's a statutory committee, the end of the consultation period is the 28th of March. So I would hope that we could, looking at the consultation responses and re-prepare a report, get maybe a special committee meeting in towards the end of April, which I believe would still allow us to hit the 9th of June Cabinet reporting deadline.
Okay, thank you. As part of this committee, I was going to have a look at the appendix where we had the consultation responses and talk about that, but I think we'll have another opportunity to do that when we can collate further responses. But just in summary, we did hear from a number of people, landlords and members of the public. There was general support within it for the 5-year licences from landlords. There was some request for a staggered approach. Presumably an update on that in the future, as Sarah said. So we'll have a more substantial discussion on the consultation responses from members of the public in the next meeting. In the meantime, if there's nothing else from anybody, we'll call the meeting. Oh, Councillor Giles, please.
Is it possible to go through the recommendations that we agreed throughout the meeting?
So in terms of proposals that were voted on, you voted on the removal of the 3-year licences. That was lost. Then the other proposal was that you would hear the consultation responses before agreeing the policy.
Actually, that I wanted to just bring up, and that is that if hopefully the wording can be changed so that it's gender neutral throughout. There is one reference